everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, The Story Ain't Over. So today I want to talk a little bit about some of the books that I really want to reread. I have been in a mood where I want to go back to some of my old favorites, and despite having a really long TBR for this month, there are a bunch of books that I want to get to pretty soon that are books that I've read before that I want to go back to because they either have a sequel coming out, or it's just been a really long time since I read them, or they're like a really big favorite of mine and I've never actually reread them, and I want to see if they live up to what I've hyped them to be in my head from like years ago. So I have a bunch of books on this list. So let's just jump right in. Alright, so the first set of books that I really want to reread are the Hunger Games trilogy. So I actually reread the first book, The Hunger Games, I think earlier this year or maybe last year. My sense of time has kind of left the building. As you can see, there's like sticky notes here which weren't there before when I first read this, which was like when I was 11. But I remember rereading this and just being blown away by how much this book still actually lived up to what I thought of it in my head. Like, it was still really good. Obviously, like, the writing is pretty simple. Suzanne Collins' writing style for the series was very like short and to the point, which I hadn't realized or noticed as much when I was younger because I wasn't really looking at writing style, but that was interesting and I just really enjoyed it. So I do really want to read the other two books, Catching Fire and Mockingjay, before the new Hunger Games book comes out this month. A ballad of snakes and songbirds and snakes, something like that. I have pre-ordered it. It is coming in the mail when it comes out. So I really want to reread these before I read that, but I also feel like that might affect how I feel about that book, but I also feel like I need a refresher on this world before I go into that book so I can enjoy it to its full amount, hoping that it is actually good, because you don't know. I feel like I'm one of those people who's very skeptical of series continuations or new books in a series that ended like years ago, because I'm always skeptical that they will actually live up to what the original series was. But we'll see. I'm excited, and also this one is set in like a different time period following different characters, so I feel like that is like a new enough aspect that I will enjoy it. So I'm very excited about that. So I really want to reread these two, and they're also really quick reads. Like, I remember I read this, like the reread, in like a day or something, and I remember when I was like 12 when I read Mockingjay, I finished that in a day because it's a really quick read. So I definitely think I could just like binge read these one day right before I read The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, if I'm getting that title right. Alright, the next book that I would really like to reread is An Ember in the Ashes by Chbosky. This is a YA fantasy, and it is one of my favorite series ever. I'm not gonna lie though, the second and third book in the series, and even the first book, are pretty long, and to be honest, rereading fantasy books isn't my favorite because I feel like I just, you know, always want to get to like the good juicy part, and there's always like a bunch of world building that, you know, if you're rereading it, you've already heard it before, so you don't really want to reread those parts again. But the reason I really want to reread these books is because the last book is coming out this year in December, I think, and I'm just so excited to see where Chbosky is going to take the series and where it's going to end, and she's probably going to kill all of my favorites, so I'm very kind of scared for that. I distinctly remember loving this first book especially. It is shorter than the other two, and it also just has a really great character arc for the characters. It takes place in this world where the Marshall Empire has taken over all the surrounding countries and places, and it follows two main characters. One is Laia, whose brother is arrested for apparently having activities with a rebel group, and she's trying to find a way to free him. And then the other main character is Elias, who is kind of part of the military and the Marshall Empire, and he is being trained to become a like high-class assassin, but he really doesn't want to do this, and he is planning to run away when Laia kind of shows up at his military academy trying to go undercover to figure out what happened to her brother. And it's just really awesome and such an amazing series with such great character development, so highly recommend if you're into fantasy. And it's also by a South Asian author with South Asian main characters, so that makes me happy. But yes, I really do want to reread this, and it is a pretty quick read. Like, it's told in first person, it's pretty fast paced, so many cutthroat characters. It's kind of like Game of Thrones in that sense, so very excited to pick this up hopefully before the last book comes out. Alright, the next set of books that I really want to reread sometime soon, probably not very soon, but hopefully, are a few classics that are some of my favorites. So the first one is Pride and Prejudice, as any good bookworm loves. I reread this like a ton of times. The 2005 Pride and Prejudice adaptation is basically everything I live for. So beautiful and just packs so much emotion, and I love it to pieces. But the book is equally amazing. Like, it just, I wish people still talked like that, you know? Like, you must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. No one says that anymore, and I just love that. That's one of the reasons why I love rereading classics from this era, because of the way they talk. I just imagine the British accents and it just makes me happy, so yeah. The other two classics that I would love to reread are Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. So Wuthering Heights is super dramatic, involves a lot of like angst and gothic elements, which I love. It is a little bit of a slower read, I feel like, compared to Pride and Prejudice, and there's a lot more like crazy shit going on. Things kind of go off the rails, but still love it. Highly recommend if you're into like dramatic shit. And then of course Jane Eyre, also equally dramatic I think as Wuthering Heights, but I love Jane Eyre because it follows her entire life from when she's a child to becoming a governess, and then, you know, working for Mr. Rochester and all of the subsequent things that happen after that. This is honestly a trip. Her life takes her to so many different like places and mental states, but there's also a lot of great gothic elements in this, and there's a lot of things to discuss in this, I feel like. And so it is definitely one of my favorite classics, but it's been a really long time and I really do want to reread this. I think out of the three, this is the one that I want to reread the most. And I'd also like to point out that when I was younger, I really didn't like reading classics, but this is the one classic that the second I picked it up, I really loved it. I kind of just ripped through the first like 100 pages, I remember, and I was like 15 when I read this, and it usually wasn't my cup of tea. I was usually reading YA, like really easy to read stuff, but for some reason this just gripped me, and I think it's because it's Jane kind of writing about her life and you're hearing it from her perspective, and I really liked that. That's just a perspective that I really love, like someone telling their life story to you. The vibe of a biography or a memoir, really love that. So I think that's why I really enjoyed this. So yes, highly recommend. All right, the next book that I would love to reread is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. So this is a book that I read I think about 4 years ago now. Oh my god. I read this in my first year of university and absolutely loved it. I read it when I was kind of down in the dumps about a lot of things, but this is a book about this like 40-year-old man or 50-year-old man who returns to his hometown, to the house where one of his best friends lived, and he ends up sitting on the bench at the house and reminiscing about the time when he used to live in this town growing up and all of the kind of weird and strange things that were going on in his life. And you start to realize that these strange and weird things that are going on in his life are kind of metaphors for the very real things that are happening in his life. And it was just such an interesting book. It's really creepy at some points, as per Neil Gaiman. It gets kind of scary at some points, but I loved it. And this kind of thing really isn't my usual cup of tea, but I loved it. And I think the reason I want to reread this is because I read this when I was relatively young, and I think I want to reread this one like now or like in a few years when I'm a little bit older and see if my perspective on it has changed, because I do think that a lot of books have that effect where they change depending on what age you come to them. So I'm curious to see how I'll feel about this when I'm older. And it's also just a really interesting way of looking at childhood as well. So yeah, really great book, highly recommend. One of my favorite Neil Gaiman books. The next book that I would love to reread is a favorite of mine. I read this when I was in grade 9. I was like a, you know, small little 13-14-year-old, and that is Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. This is one of my favorite books of all time, and I read this when I was in grade 9, and I think I've reread it I think maybe once before later in high school, but I don't think I've reread it after that. And this is one of my favorite books ever. So I really want to try rereading this and see what I think of it and if it still lives up, because I just have so many fond memories of this book. And it's also a book that like deals with mental health in a really interesting way. It has a lot of triggers, so be careful of that. But I just love the way that it's told. It follows a 9th grader and he's starting at this new school. He doesn't have a lot of friends and he's writing these letters to an anonymous friend. You don't know who that friend is, but he just starts letters with "Dear Friend," and the entire book is told that way, and I love the way that it's told. And it's such a heartwarming but also heartbreaking book, so highly recommend. And I really want to go back to it and reread it, because I'm pretty sure I will like bawl tears when I go reread this, and I feel like it'll just be a very cathartic experience. All right, the next book that I want to reread is one of my all-time favorites, but I'm not gonna lie, I've never reread this. I've read it once through and then never again, and I've reread I think certain parts of it, but it's one of my all-time favorite books, and that is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. So as I said before when I was talking about Amber and the Ashes, I feel like when it comes to fantasy books, I don't really like rereading them because you have to slog through a lot of like world building or like exposition elements that come with fantasy that you don't necessarily want to reread because you've already heard that information before. But then if you're coming to it like after a very long time, it's useful. So there's that. But I love this book. I love all the characters. I love their banter. I would go to the ends of hell for Kaz and Inej, my two faves. But I've honestly never reread this, which is so surprising to me. But I did reread the whole Shadow and Bone trilogy before King of Scars came out, and I absolutely loved that. And I really loved that series when I was in high school. That's when I first read it. This I first read in my first year of university when it came out. I went to Leigh Bardugo's Toronto signing. Absolutely loved that. But yeah, I've never reread this and I really do want to. I think the reason I haven't picked it up is because it is on the slower side. So there is that, but I think I definitely enjoy it. And I do also just want to see how well it holds up in my mind, because I have this vision of like what the characters are like and, you know, how I remember the story and things I think of fondly about it. But you know, obviously like rereading it might be different. So I'd love to see if it like changes in my mind in any way. There's also the aspect of like, there's a lot of shocking elements in this book that like now I know, and so I wonder if it'll be as enjoyable rereading it, because there's no way to replicate the feeling of reading one of your favorite books or watching one of your favorite shows or movies for the first time. Like it's just unreplicatable, and it's just so sad. So if I could read this for the first time again, I really would. All right, and the last book that I really want to reread is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This is another book that is one of my all-time favorites, but I have only read it once, and that's simply because it came out pretty recently, like only a couple years ago, and I just haven't had the chance to reread it. But it is a really quick read. I distinctly remember that. So if I decide to pick it up soon, I know I can finish it quickly, and I probably will pick it up soon because the sequel for this is coming out very soon, sometime this summer, I think. It's called A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor, which is another wonderful title. I just love these titles, and I just love this book. So I'm really curious to see where Hank Green takes this book in the second one. It deals with social media and aliens and some sci-fi elements, but fame, and it's just a crazy hodgepodge of a book, and I love it so much. And I do think it's one of those books where no one is completely like redeemable or good. I think everyone has flaws in this book, and I think that's one of the awesome things about this book. And I just found it really enjoyable and interesting the first time I read it, so I'm curious to see if I'll think the same when I reread it. And this is another one of those books where it has a lot of shocking elements or things you don't see coming, so I'm interested to see if I'll still enjoy it as much now that I know all the twists and turns. All right, so those are all the books that I want to reread sometime soon. This is not like a set TBR in any way. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the books that I wish I could reread right now or in the next little while. I honestly don't reread books a lot. There was one year when I was like in high school that I reread all of my favorite books, which was a really great summer. But on a regular basis, I'm usually just reading all the new books that I have to read, and there's always a whole shit ton. But every now and then I do like to return to a nice favorite of mine, and I do like to reread books before like a new book in the series comes out, because I do feel like it helps you kind of remember what's going on in the series. But I'd love to hear from you guys if you do reread books, or if you are like totally against it. I know when I was younger, I was like totally against rereading books because I was like, I don't need to do this. I've read it once, you know, I don't need to do that again. But then, you know, I realized the value in rereading my faves, and then I did it a lot. So yeah, let me know if you guys are into rereading books, and if any of the books on my list today are books that you guys want to reread or have reread before, and what you guys thought of it. But that's about all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video, and please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!